Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me today on the Godcast is Brian Groom. Now, Brian is a journalist who is an expert in British and regional and national affairs, and he spent many years in journalism, working for the Financial Times, and was also the former editor of Scotland on Sunday. He now is a renowned author and has this fabulous new book out called Northerners: A History. We'll talk about that in a few moments. But Brian, it's lovely to welcome you to the podcast. How are you?
Very well. Thank you, Alex. Thanks for inviting me.
A pleasure. Brian, your book is about the Northerners, but are you based in the North yourself? Where's home for Brian Groom?
Yeah. Originally, I'm from Stretford, just southwest Manchester, but I've lived in lots of other places, London and Edinburgh mainly, recently. But my wife and I returned back north to live here in 2015, and we live in Saddleworth, just northeast of Manchester in the South Pennines. Good
Is the
walking
North?
country.
Yeah, absolutely. Is the North a place you yearned for when you weren't there? Was it always? Did it always have that kind of magnet to pull you home?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I was. Oh, we were always visiting the north to visit relatives and friends whenever there are all the years of not living there. But I always missed it, and the plan was always when I retired from my full-time job that we would move back north again. So we just did it.
Yeah, great. Well, let's get down to business. Talk a bit about the book and the North. I suppose the first thing I would like to ask you, Brian, in terms of your political career and experience, I've always, ever since this term leveling up has been a thing in, I don't know, it's like a new genre, isn't it? That's been around for a couple of years, and I was wondering what your thoughts were about the differences between leveling up as a concept and leveling up as a reality. I was wondering if you could just break that down a little bit for us with your experience in the field of politics.
I'm still trying to work out what it means, and we were in the process of trying to work out what it means under Boris Johnson, and then it's been through two different versions since then. But we now have Michael Gove back in charge of it, so we're back on the sort of lines we were originally. It's still a bit ill-defined. There are various definitions in the government white paper about what it means, but it's slightly vague and it's not entirely clear exactly what it's going to mean in practice. There are a few examples. There are a few financial schemes. The whole move to try to move the English National Opera from London to Manchester potentially can be seen as part of the levelling up agenda. But what it all adds up to yet, I think, is still work in progress.
Yeah, what would you like it to mean, Brian, as a northerner? What would be your ideal?
Well, I mean, if you, I mean, in some respects, in some aspects, the North has improved since the 1980s, say, when the big cities were absolute basket cases. And I wouldn't have believed the extent to which cities such as Manchester and Leeds, and to some extent Newcastle and the others, have recovered from that low. But it's incomplete, and there are lots of areas that haven't regenerated, some former mill towns, seaside towns, coalfields, places like that, and they may need different kind of policies. But what I think unites all successful regeneration efforts anywhere, and we did see to some extent in the revival of the cities, is you need cooperation between local politicians and the local business community. And you also need a degree of buy-in from central government, sometimes in some cases central government funds. And this is our real weakness. You need programs that are designed to last for a long time. We saw that in probably the most successful regeneration effort in Europe in modern times has been that of Eastern Germany. They had a big solidarity tax in the early 1990s. They created authorities at every level in Eastern Germany, and they got these programs that have been running ever since. We tend to throw them out between, not only just between governments, but when different prime ministers from the same government come in, everything the previous one did often just gets thrown out. So under David Cameron, we had various versions. The last one being the Northern Powerhouse, and that's kind of forgotten now. And we have various variants of levelling up.
Yeah. And when we talk about the North-South divide, how I mean, I've lived in Burnley all my life, Brian, and I go down to London for synod and occasionally, but how big is the gulf? How big is the North-South divide, would you say?
I think it changes over time. In some ways, you can see it culturally narrowing at the moment with first TV and radio, and then kind of big chain stores, city centres that look the same wherever you are. Globalization, the internet and social media, we're all part of a bigger world. So in some respects, you see it narrowing, and language differences have narrowed a bit. There's we're not all talking BBC English, but there is we'll talk variants of some kind of standard English. But on the other hand, that's as I point out in the book, the economic divide has grown pretty wide. It's economically, I think you can probably count the year 1911 as the North's high point, when it had 36.5% of England's population. But since then, it now has 27.5% of England's population, and there's an even bigger drop in its share of Britain's economic output, from 30% just after the First World War to below 20% today. So it's a big place, but in relative terms, it's got a long way to go.
Yeah. And talking about the book, Brian, this is a book that's doing fabulously well at the moment. How long has this book been in the making? Was this something you were thinking about while you were still working, or was it a labour of love when you retired? Just tell us a bit how the book actually came to be here now in hardback.
Yeah, well, I first had the idea about 10 years ago while I was still working, and the kind of background with me is that I was a history mad kid. But then through various personal reasons, I went off it a bit in my late teens, and I did English at university. But I've come back to history a bit more as I've got older, as people often do when you start to think about where you come from and who you're connected to. And second, I was a journalist, and that's kind of like witnessing history in real time. And I tended to specialise in regional and British affairs, and I'm a northerner. So if you put all those together, if you think of a book to do, it's an obvious idea to think of. And I was astonished to discover when I looked at it that it had only ever been done once before. There's only one previously published general history of Northern England, and that came out in 1990. So it seemed to me there's a gap and an opportunity there.
The book is so full of history and information, but the North's been around for a very long time. How did you how did you plan where to start the book? What was your thinking? Where would be the starting point for you?
Well, obviously, I started by reading the one existing book that had done it, which was kind of quite old-fashioned. It was a book called The North of England by a chap called Eric Musgrove, who was a retired education professor from Manchester University. A bit crusty, full of facts, some very good facts, but not many people, and certainly no women. So that's a bit old-fashioned. Where did I start? I mean, the kind of loose model I had in mind at the beginning was Peter Ackroyd's London, the Biography, a very famous book, came out 20 years ago, that kind of follows the timeline of a city, but it wanders all over the place while it's doing so, and tells you fascinating social and cultural things about the place. So I thought that kind of mix would work. So there are lots of cross-cutting chapters on social and cultural themes, like prominent northern women and reformers, writers and artists, how the language divide developed, the story of the North's ethnic minorities, and the importance of sheep. But in the end, I ended up probably doing more narrative history than I'd expected. And that's partly because it's just a very compelling story. It's
Yeah.
hard to boil it, simplify it too much. And most people know, lots of people know bits of the story, parts of it, um, but probably haven't seen it put together, how it fits into an overall pattern.
Yeah, you can't lead me up the garden path talking about sheep and their importance. Just expand on that a bit, Brian. Tell us how and why sheep were so important, and perhaps still are.
Really, well, it kind of groups two things together. The medieval woolen industry focused on mostly Cistercian abbeys in Yorkshire and elsewhere, who kind of industrialized the raising of sheep, which had been done in small numbers before. They turned it into a complete industry. They employed what were known as lay brothers, which we now would call gig economy workers, to look after their sheep, and they raised them for their wool, and the wool got shipped to other abbeys in the Low Countries that specialised in turning it into cloth.
Mm.
And then I move on through how the industry evolved, and it just tells the story of the Industrial Revolution and the woolen industry in
Yeah,
Yorkshire and other
yeah,
places. So that's that's pretty much what the sheep does, and what it plays into is one big thing about the history of the North and the North-South divide is historians sometimes talk about England as being divided into a highland zone and a lowland zone. I mean, it's an oversimplification because there are arable areas in the north, like the Vale of York and the Northumbrian Plain, but broadly, north and west of what is known as the Jurassic Divide, a stretch of Jurassic rock that stretches from Dorset up to the Yorkshire coast. North and west of it, you tend to get higher ground, hills and mountains, thinner soils, suitable for raising sheep, particularly, in some places cattle as well. That's where the sheep come in. And it was a different development pattern from places south and east of that, which tended to have richer farmland suitable for growing arable crops. And in the north and the west, you tended to get isolated farmsteads and small hamlets forming. South and east, you got larger villages forming and generally wealthier through most of history. So there's evidence of things like pottery emerging much earlier in the south and east than there is in the north and west. So these things all tie together.
yeah. It's all fascinating stuff. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm working my way through the book, but there are three things that I just wanted to pick up on. Really, what the first one was that you write really lovely about Bede and Hilda in Northumbria. What was your attraction to writing about those? I mean, as a priest, I can see the attraction, but what was the fascination in that story to tell their way in life?
Well, I think it was partly because I knew less about that period than about some of the more modern periods. I'd never studied the history of the Kingdom of Northumbria, so it was all new to me and all fascinating. And you can see it, I think, to me it appeals. It's the North's main high point aside from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, it influenced the whole world economically, but not so much politically. But the Kingdom of Northumbria, it was for a short period Northern Europe's leading intellectual, artistic, and Christian centre. And it had transformed itself into that in less than a century from an illiterate pagan society. So it was a very, very rapid and fantastic change. And it kind of ties into the modern day as well, in that if it's one of the great what ifs of history. If it had lasted longer, perhaps the North will be part of a kind of very different kind of Britain ruled from the North, rather than one being a more outlying region of one governed from the South.
And did that exploration of Bede? Did you venture up to Holy Island and places like Durham and Whitby to learn and feel? I've just recently returned on a pilgrimage, to walk in the footsteps of these people.
Not while writing the book, but we actually did do a walked Oswald's Way about 5 years ago, which is gets you to Lindisfarne by walking across the sands, and I've been to Whitby several times. But one of the irony people say to me, you must have traveled all over the place to write this book. Actually, while I was working the book, I was sitting in a seat reading books. I was traveling nowhere because I had to get on with it. In a sense, one of the joys of what's happened afterwards is I've got book to talk in quite a lot of pieces right across the north. So I've got to visit all the places I was writing about and learn a bit more about them.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that I picked up from the book, and probably it comes as no surprise as being a Burnley guy, is this cotton industry that was kind of reached extraordinary levels quite quickly, didn't it? But then it collapsed quite quickly as well. What are your reflections on that period of time for the North?
Yes, in a way, it had a kind of illusion of security in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. People thought it was such a great industry that nothing could damage it. Then the First World War came along, and India in particular, which had been a massive market, started making its own textiles, and other countries, several other countries have started getting into it, or particularly in Asia in the late 19th century. So a series and then the slump coming after that. So you're right, it did then start to decline pretty steeply, though it wasn't until I think it was it's in the book somewhere. I think it was not until the late 70s that we started becoming a net importer of cotton textiles for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. So it took a little bit of a while.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating for me, as I say, from being from Burnley. I hear, I do funeral services, and speaking to some of the more elderly members of the community. There was somebody who recently told me there's a high point in Burnley called Crown Point, where there is a wonderful sculpture called the Singing Ringing Tree, and this gentleman was telling me how he used to go up to that point and he'd look across Burnley, where he counted, I think he said he counted 85 chimneys, and industrial chimney pots at that as well. And he was kind of lamenting how that industry had collapsed. And I suppose one of the legacies of all that is that many of the buildings remained, and in parts of Burnley and Nelson and Colton, there are still many mill places that have either been converted into flats, and thinking about places like Argos as well in Manchester, where this huge regeneration program has taken place. I'm just wondering, do you think that, we're now kind of a world of digital manufacturing, if that's the right word? Burnley's become a plethora of boohoo super outlets and factories kind of thing. Do you think we'll ever see an industrial period again in the UK, Brian, as I've just witted on about there? Or do you think that day is gone forever?
Well, probably not to the extent, anything like the extent it once was. I mean, up to the pandemic, the decline of British manufacturing had bottomed out, really. It had at one time it was more than half the British economy, but over the past 10, 15 years been stable at around 10%. And there's been some modest reshoring, as they call it, of production from Asia. Manufacturing is going through a particularly tough time at the moment with the inflation and cost of living crisis and various cost crises. So it's not. So I don't know what the outcome of that is. There are hopes that the North, in particular, will be able to capture some of the so-called green industries. That's the big hope of many. But it's not. There are competitors, and it's not easy to do. Like an attempt to establish a big car battery factory in Northumberland seems to be foundering at the moment. So it's not a given that can do that, but there is some opportunity to get a bit more manufacturing, and also the other factors like more difficult relations with China. I mean, companies think twice about concentrating all their production in China. Things like 3D printing give you the opportunity for sort of manufacturing things in small batches closer to home. So it's not certain by any means, but I wouldn't rule out a sort of some kind of mini revival of manufacturing.
And when you wrote your book, Brian, what surprises did it reveal to you as an individual? You know, those were there some kind of wow moments for you as you were doing the research that you thought, wow, I just never knew that. What were the real highs of writing a book? I mean, you know, I've written a book myself. It's tough going at times, isn't it? But there are also these times of kind of euphoria and great joy. What were they for you?
Well, I think the thing that surprised me most was reading about the extent of Lancashire's working class conservative voting pattern, which I knew a little bit about before, but I hadn't really thought about it. It's quite a phenomenon, and the and that took me into things like the history of. I mean, some of it's much debated what might have caused this, but it's quite predominant. There was a lot more Lancashire working class people voted Tory than in the northeast or in Yorkshire. Historically, and it was right until the late 20th century. A lot of it's probably got to do with hostility to Irish Catholic immigration, certainly the case in Liverpool. And reading about Liverpool's history, it actually became dominated by the Conservative Party from 1841 right until the 1970s. Well, that's kind of been airbrushed out of history. It's not something that people think of anymore about Liverpool. So that was quite a surprise and fascinating to go into.
It's quite interesting because Burnley has got a lot of residual conservative clubs around the place, and I've often thought, gosh, there's a lot of conservative clubs around Burnley, considering that it is a Labour voting town. But moving that on a little bit, Brian, when we think about Lancashire in terms of Brexit, you know, and we look at Burnley and Burnley, not only did it lose its Labour seat, which is for the first time in, well, decades and decades, that it also was a very strong vote in favour of Brexit. I was just wondering why you feel, as a historian, why you feel that people, you know, many northern Lancashire towns, Yorkshire towns, moved away from the Labour Party and actually moved away from the idea of a European Union and became Brexiteers. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, if you look deeper into history, the North often likes to think of itself as a radical area, you know, the home of where the Labour Party was created, the home of causes like the Chartists and in the 20th century, the suffragettes and all these kind of things. But there's also a strong conservative strand in its history, a social conservative strand in its history, particularly before the Industrial Revolution when it was a more rural place. We saw it particularly in the Tudor era with a couple of major revolts against central government policy, which was basically they were opposed to the Reformation and feared for changes to their kind of traditional ways and values of doing things, as well as the abolition, Henry VIII's abolition of the monasteries. And if you look at during the civil wars as well, the royalists tended to get their support from northern and western England, which are more rural and conservative, whereas Parliament tend to get its support from London and the southeast and the emerging towns and cities, which is similar to the pattern we saw in the Brexit referendum. So it's not completely new in terms of the North's history. And it's now, even the 20th century, it's never been a sort of Labour monolith. It's been, what people call the Red Wall is tightly defined. It's places that Labour held for a long time, but there are some places that have been marginals that have changed hands a few times that often get lumped in with it as well. And it shouldn't be a complete surprise because the North had a higher no vote than the rest of the country in the 1975 EU referendum. And to some extent, some of it's explicable through demographics. Brexit in 2016 tended to be more popular among older voters and non-graduates, and the North has a higher proportion of those than other regions do. Um, um, but it's true that it was a factor in those red wall seats that went, and it's affecting politics now. I'm sure it's a driving factor in why Keir Starmer is talking about not going back to any free movement of labour within the aligned with the EU.
Yeah. So it's all fascinating stuff, Brian. I'm conscious of time, but I do want to just touch on an area that in your book, which is the Victorian period, and there's somebody who got a real affinity with seaside towns. I think it was probably because my parents brought me up on summer season entertainment, but the history of places like Blackpool, I see Victorian images of, the seafront being absolutely crammed with people, and elephants bathing in the sea from the circus. That was an extraordinary period of time as well, wasn't it? Where that still has a legacy of people coming down from Scotland for their holidays, but the decline of you touched on it at the beginning of the interview. The decline of seaside towns has been quite stark, and I suppose there are green shoots of recovery in certain places, but there's still a real kind of, there's a lot of work to do in these places, isn't there?
There is, yes, and the seaside towns in particular, a lot of it stems from the growth of foreign holidays in the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, Blackpool was doing pretty well until the 1990s, really. It's mainly the last 20, 25 years that it's struggled more. As you say, its growth was absolutely spectacular from the late 19th century. It was a sea bathing spot for the wealthy. But suddenly during the later 19th century, average real wages were rising and people were starting to get a bit of leisure time. So that's why you started to see the growth of things like the music hall and the seaside. And it coincided with the coming of the railways, which brought day trippers and travellers from all over the north, and, as you say, from Glasgow and the Midlands to Blackpool. So that became its golden era, and in fact, its number of visitors carried on growing after the First World War. So even into the late 1930s. And one of the fascinating things I did get into in the book was interesting to learn about was that though everyone thinks of the 20s and 30s as being a really tough time for the North, in many ways, many parts of it, it was, particularly Tyneside. But if you had a job, things were improving, and there's a great divide. And then people in employment were getting rising real wages and paid holidays coming along, and the growth of white collar and middle class occupations. A lot of you'll probably all know them. Lots of new suburbs started being created in the 1920s and 30s. So a lot of these periods are more mixed than you think they are.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, because there's a working steam mill in Burnley called the Queen Street Mill, and I was interested to learn about the people that worked there. They weren't badly paid. They were rewarded quite well for the day's work that they did, and that surprised me somewhat. And it's interesting to hear you say that about that period of time. And looking forward, Brian, I mean, this is a deep well of material, isn't it? Are you working on a new one? Have you got plans for another one? What's your thoughts there?
I'm working on another one. I can't say publicly what it's going to be yet. There's going to be an announcement in the new year, probably. All I can say is I'm already behind with it.
Yeah, yeah. And the response, is it been what you expected? Has it been more? The joy of having your book published. Just tell us about the personal feeling and feeling of satisfaction that you've got from that.
Well, great. I mean, I didn't think I was guaranteed to get it published at all. I think, fortunate that Harper North, both our publisher, this new Manchester-based imprint of Harper HarperCollins came along just at the right point when I was looking for a publisher. My big fear all along was that it would be seen as too local for the national and international publishing market, and yet at the same time not local enough for the specialist local history, local interest press. There's not many books about the North as a whole ever get published, and most of the ones that do are slightly quirky personal memoirs. So it wasn't guaranteed. But I always thought that if I get into people's hands, it's just such an interesting story that deserves to be told and isn't often told. I didn't expect it to do as well as it has been doing, and it's been very gratifying, and it's pleasing that people find it readable enough, because the whole aim was to try to make something that's accessible to general readers, but is sufficiently intellectually rigorous not to get into trouble with academics.
Yeah. And with the new book, Brian, are you exploring new ideas, or are you digging deeper into some of the stories that you've uncovered already, or a bit of both?
There are actually two books in the pipeline. One is more completely new, and one is going deeper into some aspects of the things I've already, to some extent, been looking at.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here it is. Let's give it another plug. It's Northerners: A History from the Ice Age to the Present Day. It's by Brian Groom. It's published by our friends at Harper North, and I think it's not too late to go out and get a Christmas present. It's really fascinating. It's got something in there for everyone, so I would highly recommend it. Brian, thanks very much for coming on the Godcast. It's lovely to meet you. I've seen you on social media and whatnot, and continued success with the book. And thank you for coming on the Godcast.
Thanks, Alex. I've enjoyed it.